Yeah, thank you very much for your kind introduction and providing me with the opportunity to present my paper at this conference. My contribution on the topic, New Ways of Seeing on Paradigms of National Canon Formation in Irish Modernism, is part of my completed PhD project on the artist Jack Butler Yeats. In 1972, writer and art critic John Bircher wrote in a seminal book, Ways of Seeing, based on his eponymous TV series that, quote, "The way we see things is affected by what we know and what we believe," end quote. He related to the idea that canonized beliefs of the world influence art production and art reception. In my paper, I would like to draw on Bircher's critical approach and transfer it to notions of national identity in art, more precisely in Irish modernism. In this context, it is noteworthy that Bircher wrote several essays on the Irish artist Jack B. Yeats in the 1950s. Yet remarkably in this text, he did not relate Yeats' paintings to national cliches, but instead described his artistic approach as, quote, universal, end quote. With this interpretation, Bircher differed from contemporary British critics such as Kenneth Clark. In 1942, Clark organized the double exhibition Nicholson and Yeats at the National Gallery. On the occasion of this exhibition, Clark also wrote a review in which he placed Yeats' work, I quote, on the outer rim of European painting, end quote, due to an ascribed, quote, native flavor, end quote. Bircher's and Clark's ways of looking at Irish modernism thus represent two antagonistic perspectives on the reception of art, characterized by a strong affiliation between art, politics, and the reference to national labels. By using the example of Irish modernism, I will examine from a historical critical perspective by what means images served as labels of nationality and what long-lasting effects such attributions had on the reception of art. Serving this aim, I structure my paper in three aspects. First, defining the self, Thomas McGreevy and Jack B. Yeats. Second, determining the other, Louis Le Brocq and British criticism. And third, identities and transformation or beyond national labels. Defining the self, Thomas McGreevy and Jack B. Yeats. In 1922, only a few weeks after the establishment of the Irish Free State, Thomas McGreevy published a short but pointed text, Painting in Modern Ireland, The Rise of the National School, in which he discusses the formation of a national style. McGreevy played a central role in Irish cultural life as a poet, art critic, and later the director of the National Gallery of Ireland. He continually commented on art and pleaded, unlike his friend Samuel Beckett, for a national reading of 20th century Irish art. Beckett, on the other hand, who had finally turned his back on Ireland in 1937, wanted Irish art known to be discussed in a global context. With this demand, he early foresaw the problem of a one-sided national classification that would be difficult to revise in retrospect. In contrast, McGreevy was primarily concerned with the connection between art and national identity. He begins his text, Painting in Modern Ireland, by mentioning Dutch painting of the Golden Age and describing how art and national self-confidence were closely intertwined. He then names artists who, in his opinion, could be strongly associated with their country, Velázquez, Rembrandt, and Watteau. For Irish art, however, he could not identify any independent pictorial language in the past since, according to him, English, Italian, or French borrowings are far too obvious. I quote, "Now, though there have been fine Irish painters in the past, of none of them it can be said that he painted anything that was essentially characteristically Irish," end quote. In the following, McGreevy highlights one artist in particular as an example of a potential Irish school, the painter Jack B. Yeats. Yeats, who was born into a family of artists in London in 1871 and died in Dublin in 1957, dealt with Irish themes throughout his lifetime, much like his brother, the poet and Nobel Prize winner for literature, W.B. Yeats. This focus, which McGreevy took note of, led the critic to stylize the painter as a national artist in his future writings. But already as early as 1922, McGreevy defined what would distinguish Yeats as a specifically Irish artist. I quote, "20 years ago, Mr. Yeats took up his brush and without apparent effort or consciously revolutionary intent, painted pictures that are as Irish as Teniers pictures are Dutch. He left Dublin drawing rooms and went to Kerry and to Galway and looked around him. And he saw the giants of the West in boats and dances. He saw their small boats playing marbles and riding donkeys and sitting in circuses. And he was so thrilled by what he saw that he had to make pictures out of it. And now, instead of lagging behind those of his contemporaries who followed the English tradition, he has come to be recognized in the estimation of all serious critics as the first truly Irish painter, end quote. McGreevy thus creates the image of an anti-academic artist who could detach himself from foreign, more precisely English influences, to devote himself in a new way to Irish everyday life, and especially to life in the west of the country, which was perceived as vernacular. Within 20th century Irish culture, the West represented a region that, far from English influence, was particularly predestined for the semantic charging of a supposedly original and at the same time new Ireland. Thus, from 1900 onwards, Yeats and many other artists of the so-called Celtic revival traveled the region and found the original way of life, the landscape, as well as the practice of the Irish language appealing. This rediscovery of a specifically Irish culture marked a strong contrast to the former representation of the Irish West, as can be seen, for instance, in Trevor Thomas Fowler's picture, Children Dancing at the Crossroads, painted around 1835. In pastoral paintings like these, the Irish periphery was depicted in a very pleasing way and with an obvious recourse to Dutch genre painting that corresponded to the taste of the Royal Academy in London. The stereotypical message conveyed by the picture is that the Irish are merry people who like to dance and drink. In contrast, scenes of the Great Famine of the mid-19th century or of rebellion are almost completely absent from Irish art history. The idyllic motifs were ideally suited to convey to the upper British middle class and above all to the English public how naive and harmless the Irish population was. This presentation was based on a decidedly colonial gaze. The structure of representation distinguished between center and periphery, and at the same time aimed at the appropriation of the self and other. McGreevy's appraisal of Yeats as a genuine painter of Irish life has to be considered against this background. This context can also explain why McGreevy ignored the fact that Yeats drew unidealized depictions, as a comparison between contemporary photographs and Yeats' drawings demonstrates. He moreover undermined the artist's long-standing education at several London art schools by untruthfully claiming that Yeats did only study in Dublin drawing rooms. The importance McGreevy attached to the negation of English or foreign influence is shown by his repeated emphasis on national affiliation as the essential prerequisite for an Irish school. I quote, "A great painter who happens to be an Irishman will belong truly to us, and we shall be perfectly interpreted by him if his subject matter is taken from the life about him," end quote. In this sense, McGreevy characterizes Belfast-born painter Paul Henry as a less typical representative of his country, since the artist supposedly sees his subjects through the eyes of a post-impressionist Frenchman. Although Henry had initially studied in Belfast, he subsequently went to Paris, which, according to McGreevy, also clouded the artist's view of his typically Irish subject. I quote, "I do not think Mr. Henry can be considered as belonging to Belfast. He paints pictures of the West by way of Paris," end quote. And even though Henry had already been living in Ireland again for 12 years, when the article came out, the protagonists created on Echo Island, unlike Yeats' Islanders, appeared to McGreevy to be rather dramatized versions of Irish country folk. The critic thus argued that only when Henry was ready to break away from his previous way of painting did he have the prospect of becoming more Irish. The white cottages that increasingly appeared in his pictures could function as, I quote, "effective labels of nationality as the windmills in a Dutch picture," end quote. For the critic, therefore, not only the form and content of the artworks, but also the artist's place of activity was essential in order to classify their art production as genuinely Irish. Determining the other, Louis Le Brocq and British criticism. The classification of Irish art as deviant from foreign traditions also played a central role in British criticism, but under inverted auspices. Concerning the construction of a national style, the tension between post-colonial Irish self-assertion and the British gesture of superiority is an essential factor that cannot be ignored. British assessments of Irish art, such as those made by Herbert Read and Kenneth Clark, reveal a position characterized by negative connotations and stereotyped images that habitually derive from former supremacy. These representatives aim to classify 20th century Irish art as unmodern in their diminishing or at least ambivalent valuations. In particular, the recourse to a specifically Celtic entity, which had been debated under opposing auspices on both the English and Irish sides since the 19th century, resurfaced in British art reviews in the mid-20th century. Such assignments were not limited to nationally appropriated painters such as Jack B. Yeats, but were also transferred to subsequent generations of artists, shown by the example of Louis Le Brocq. The Dublin-born painter chose to move to London in 1946 and has been celebrated by critics and galleries since then. A review written by Herbert Read in 1957, however, demonstrates that critics understood the painter's art through his origins and his ability to break away from them. I quote, "This painter from Joyce's Dublin did seem when I first met him in 1944 to have some qualities of Celtic origin. His images might have been found in a crock of gold, and both Yeats the poet and his brother, the painter, might have been among his ancestors. But since then, Le Brocq's art has become emancipated from provincial myth and is now both independent and universal," end quote. Here we contrast Le Brocq's former artistic approach, which he related to a Celtic origin and provincial myth, with his new style, through which Le Brocq achieved an independent and universal dimension. Furthermore, he mentions both William Butler and Jack B. Yeats as Le Brocq's ancestors, whose art had not yet overcome the status of provincial myth. This assessment is irritating insofar as Le Brocq appreciated Jack B. Yeats' artistic approach and therefore hardly identified a paradigm shift between the work of the older colleague and his own art. Thus, the questions arise on what ground Read's judgment rested upon and to what extent it can be linked to Le Brocq's art. In his early work dating from 1940, the self-taught Le Brocq first turned to depictions of Irish travelers, thus placing himself in an Irish tradition. In this context, Yeats' watercolor A Tinker, created around 1905, seems to anticipate Le Brocq's early paintings. However, Le Brocq located the subject of the traveler also in a global context, regarding it as a universal symbol that could express, I quote, "the individual as opposed to organized settled society," end quote. Despite the supranational approach, the artist was only perceived as modern by the British press due to an alleged change of style. This artistic upheaval was justified thematically and aesthetically. Whereas in his Tinker series, Le Brocq had worked predominantly in color, he turned to a monochrome working method and the family motif in his Grey series. And although the transition between the two series can rather be regarded as continuous artistic development, only Le Brocq's supposedly new orientation was considered British, meaning universal and independent. Referring to Read's estimation on Le Brocq, Luke Gibbons pointed out in 2014 that the painter had to give up his Irishness to be regarded as a representative of high modernism. He also stated that, I quote, "this shedding of nationality was not required in the case of British artists," end quote. Although Le Brocq's motif of the traveler can be interpreted in a cross-cultural context, since it not only refers to Ireland's neutral position as a political outsider during World War II, but also to the dispossessed of post-war Europe, British critics were not ready yet to connect Irish culture and modernism. This debate therefore demonstrates the limitations of art historical interpretations based on national analysis criteria and their long-lasting effects. The reasons for this persistence seem to root in the intricate power structure of the discourse of national identity, which, due to the constant assessment of the self and the other, determines a specific discussion on art. With regard to Le Brocq, this discourse, which is built on the politics of difference, constitutes a concept of cultural singularity. It produces an almost exclusively national reading of his oeuvre, perpetually validated through affirmative or critical analysis. Identities and transformation or beyond national labels. The considerations on Yeats and Le Brocq mentioned above demonstrated that both domestic and foreign debates have prefigured a persistent cliched image of Irish art. In particular, the perception of the island as a rural, primitive, and tradition-conscious place has influenced its reception in this respect, repeatedly describing it as peripheral and unmodern. Both British and Irish critics shaped the image against a post-colonial background. While British criticism resulting from a hegemonic habitus classified Irish art as provincial, Irish reception positively reinterpreted the country's assigned outsider position in terms of an anti-English reading. Such politicized art debates made it difficult for Irish artists to establish themselves with their pictures within global modernism. As a result, this focus on the national context led to a one-dimensional perception of painters' oeuvres and to a neglect of iconographical analysis. Le Brocq exemplifies the paradox of the compulsion for national categorization, since he had lived in France since 1960 and only returned to Ireland in 2000. Accordingly, his access to art was strongly shaped by the idea of artistic exchanges between Ireland and Europe. This exchange becomes apparent in his head images. The painter traced the source of inspiration for these reduced portraits back to his encounter with the Celto-Ligurian head cult of Entremont and Roquepertus in the Provence. Subsequently, he intertwined the ancient Celtic with the Gallic world in these images. Consequently, his work is characterized by engagement with numerous cultures. The preoccupation with the Irish entity is merely one of many. This circumstance also applies to Yeats. It is true that Yeats dealt intensively with national themes throughout his life and continuously reflected the political situation in Ireland. Nevertheless, his work is, in my opinion, characterized by a hybrid character, which is based on numerous stays abroad in Europe and the USA, and his engagement with international art. Many of the works, primarily Yeats' New York reflections, are to be understood as visualizations of transcultural entanglements that penetrate national borders and bring the permeability of cultures into focus. In this context, the painter did not work in local isolation. In contrast, the artist permanently faced global art history, starting with his preoccupation with Hokusai, extending to his affinity for the American Ashcan School representatives, or European artists such as Walter Sickert and Oskar Kokoschka. Let me conclude. Investigating art apart from national analysis criteria and political agendas can only be successful when national canon formation mechanisms are deconstructed and the artist's productions are placed in a global context with the help of transcultural perspectives. Concerning Yeats, the 2019 exhibition Life Above Everything, Lucian Freud and Jack B. Yeats, shown at Dublin's Irish Museum of Modern Art, serves as a positive example. The merit of this exposition and its underlying research is that it has significantly broadened the perspective on the work of both artists. The result in Yeats's case was his removal from the national vacuum and his embedding in a larger context. For Freud, too, this perspective offers the opportunity to understand the painter more outside his London sphere of activity. The exhibition thus challenged traditional ways of seeing by dispensing with the established use of national labels and instead focusing entirely on art itself. It shows that we are on the right track. Thank you.